The funny thing is, the whole mess started with something most people don't even think about anymore. Internet. Not passwords. Not hackers. Not even money. Just a cable. One quiet line running from a pole to my house. Until the morning I woke up and realized someone had decided it didn't belong to me anymore. When I bought that little house on Birchwood Avenue, it wasn't because I dreamed of settling down in a picturesque neighborhood with perfect lawns and matching mailboxes. It was cheap. It was solid. It had a detached garage that I could turn into an office. That was the dream. A door I could close, a desk that didn't wobble, and enough quiet to work without hearing my neighbor's television bleed through the walls. I worked remotely as a systems analyst for a private contractor. Not the movie kind of stuff. No explosions, no satellites falling out of the sky. Mostly infrastructure, redundancy planning, boring things that only matter when they fail. But boring or not, the job demanded one thing above all else: stability. Low latency. A connection that didn't blink when everyone else in the neighborhood fired up Netflix at 7 p.m. So I invested in it. Trenching done clean. Conduit buried properly. Patch panel mounted straight. A fiber modem that could handle far more than I actually needed, because that's how I sleep at night. Knowing the system can take a hit and keep going. I was proud of it. Quietly proud. I didn't talk about it, didn't show it off, but someone noticed anyway. Her name wasn't actually Karen. That's just what everyone called her once they felt safe doing it. On paper, she was Margaret Vance, president of the Birchwood Homeowners Association, retired, organized, impossibly punctual. The kind of person who didn't knock so much as announce herself by standing in your peripheral vision until you noticed her. She had a clipboard, always, and that clipboard seemed to carry weight. Not physical weight, but social gravity. People straightened up when they saw it. Conversations shortened. Dogs were suddenly leashed. Trash cans were wheeled in a little faster. At first, our interactions were harmless. Polite nods, neutral smiles. A comment about the weather. Then one afternoon, she stopped at the end of my driveway and tilted her head like she'd spotted a crack in the foundation of reality. "Is that an antenna on your roof?" she asked. I told her yes, it was part of the fiber termination. Barely visible, painted to match. She frowned, scribbled something, and said she would check the bylaws. That was the beginning. After that, there was always something. A question about cable routing. A concern about visual clutter. A complaint about a satellite dish I didn't own. Once, she accused me of hosting commercial equipment because a technician had parked a van on the street for longer than she found acceptable. Every conversation felt like a test I hadn't studied for. She spoke in rules, in clauses, in phrases like community standards and neighborhood integrity. And the thing was, I wasn't breaking any of them. Kai repeatedly. I kept copies, highlighted sections, but logic didn't slow her down. If anything, it made her more focused. I started to feel watched. Not in a paranoid way, just aware. Like every small thing I did had an audience. And that audience was waiting for me to slip. Still, I figured it would pass. People like that usually burn themselves out. They move on to a new target, or they get distracted by something bigger. So I kept my head down and worked. Then came Monday. I remember it because everything felt wrong before I even understood why. I walked into my kitchen and didn't hear the soft hum from the fridge panel telling me I'd left the door open too long. My phone didn't buzz with overnight alerts. The smart thermostat screen was dark. I tapped my phone. No signal. No Wi-Fi. No cellular data loading anything useful. At first, I shrugged it off. How'd it just happen? I grabbed a hoodie, poured some coffee, and decided to check the external junction box before calling anyone. It was a habit, to control what you can before escalating. The weather was clear, no wind. No rain. No reason for failure. When I walked around the back fence, I saw it immediately. The cable was gone. Not ripped, not frayed, not damaged by a lawn, tool, or an animal. Cleanly cut, a precise break where the fiber dropped into the ground box. Whoever did it hadn't hesitated. They hadn't panicked. They had measured, cut, and walked away. I just stood there for a moment, staring at it, feeling that slow, heavy drop in my chest. The kind that tells you this isn't just an inconvenience. This is intent. I called the provider. They checked the node. Everything upstream was fine. The neighborhood was live. My line, they said, was dark. We'll send a crew tomorrow morning, the rep told me, cheerful in that scripted way. In the meantime, she offered a temporary hotspot. I didn't bother explaining how useless that would be for my work. I hadn't even finished the call when I heard footsteps on my porch. Margaret stood there like she'd been waiting for a cue. Hair perfect, clipboard tucked under her arm, eyes sharp. "You should really be more mindful of how your cables run," she said, pointing past me toward the yard. "It's not very becoming, and it could cause issues." I felt something tighten in my jaw. "Are you saying you cut it?" I asked. She blinked once, slow. "Controlled? Of course not," she said. "I just noticed it that way, and I reported it. Like I'm supposed to." That was the moment I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry exactly, but because my brain wouldn't let go of the pattern. Clean cut. Perfect timing. Her showing up minutes after I got off the phone. Margaret had always liked documentation, liked being first to report, first to frame the narrative. If something went wrong in this neighborhood, she wanted her version to be the official one before anyone else even noticed there was a problem. By sunrise, the outage had already started bleeding into my workday. I sent a short message to my supervisor, explaining the situation, vague on details, careful not to sound alarmist. Infrastructure issue, provider dispatched, working on redundancy. That sort of language, calm language, the kind that buys you a little grace. At around 8:30, the first truck rolled in. White utility van, no markings beyond a magnetic logo slapped on the door. 2 techs got out, both carrying coffee, both with that tired competence you see in people who fix the same mistakes over and over again. I walked them to the back fence. One of them crouched down, ran his fingers along the sheath, and let out a low whistle. "Yeah, this isn't weather," he said. "That's a tool cut. Clean. Intentional." I asked him if he could splice it. He shook his head. "We'll need to rerun the drop and test upstream. Shouldn't take too long, but we've got to document this, especially because of what this line feeds into." He paused, looked at me sideways. "You work remote, right? Government contract." I nodded. Didn't elaborate. That was all it took. He stepped aside and made a call. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but I caught enough to feel that familiar chill you get when something small crosses into a bigger system. Dedicated circuit, commercial exchange, monitoring flag. That kind of language, the kind that doesn't usually apply to a quiet street with bird feeders and chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Within an hour, the street started to change. First came another van, then a dark sedan that didn't belong to anyone I recognized. Then another. They parked neatly, deliberately, not blocking driveways, not drawing attention, and somehow drawing all of it. Anyway, people started peeking through blinds. Doors opened. Someone across the street stopped mowing their lawn and just stood there, hands on hips. Watching Margaret appeared at the edge of her driveway, clipboard clutched like a life raft. She looked unsettled, still composed, but there was a tightness around her mouth I hadn't seen before. This was beyond her usual jurisdiction. These weren't HOA issues. These weren't warning letters she could copy and paste. 2 men and a woman approached me. Professional, polite, calm in that way that suggests they're used to chaos and don't feel the need to perform urgency. They asked for my ID, me to confirm my employment, my schedule, the last time the connection had been stable. I answered. Honestly, carefully, the way you do when you know accuracy matters more than speed. One of them nodded, taking notes, and explained that the severed cable had briefly interrupted a routed communications path tied into a monitored system. Nothing catastrophic, nothing dramatic, but enough to trigger a protocol review. In other words, my missing internet had tripped an alarm someone much higher up the ladder cared about. That's when they turned toward Margaret. "Ma'am," one of them said, "would you mind answering a few questions?" She smiled. "Too quickly. Too practiced." "Course not," she said. "I'm the HOA president. I keep detailed records of everything that happens here." She launched into her story before they even finished asking. How she'd noticed the cable while doing her morning walk. How she'd immediately reported it. How important community standards were to her. How dangerous exposed infrastructure could be. They listened. They always do. Then they asked about the timeline. "What time was your walk, ma'am?" She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Long enough to be noticeable. "Early," she said. "Round 6. The woman with the notepad tilted her head slightly. "Interesting," she said, because the service interruption registered at 2:14 a.m. Margaret's grip tightened on the clipboard. I watched from a few steps away, heart pounding. Not with triumph, but with something closer to disbelief. I hadn't planned this. I hadn't orchestrated anything. I just wanted my internet back. But now the machinery was moving, and it didn't care about neighborhood politics. They asked her where she'd been the night before, who had access to the alley behind the houses, whether she owned any tools that could cut reinforced fiber. She answered. Quickly. Too quickly. That's when a man from the house across the alley spoke up. Arthur, quiet guy. IT consultant, keeps to himself. He raised his hand like he was in a classroom. I don't want to cause trouble, he said, but my security camera might have something. Everyone turned. He pulled up footage on his phone. Grainy night vision. Time stamp, clear as day. 2:12 a.m. Margaret, unmistakable, even in infrared, pacing along the fence line. Stopping, standing. Bending down, standing back up. The street went silent. Margaret's face drained of color. That clip changed everything. The agents didn't raise their voices. They didn't accuse. They just shifted gears. Asked Margaret to step aside. Asked her for consent to review call logs. Asked for clarification on earlier statements. The clipboard slipped from her hand and clattered onto the concrete. By late morning, the repair crew had finished rerunning the line. Tests came back clean. My modem blinked to life, steady and strong. The connection was restored faster than it had ever been. But the real damage had already been done. Statements were taken. Evidence logged. The severed cable was bagged and tagged. Margaret was escorted back to her house, not in cuffs, with spectacle, but with the unmistakable weight of consequence hanging over her shoulders. By noon, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting. No snacks, no pleasantries. Just facts laid out on folding tables and a room full of people realizing they'd empowered the wrong person for far too long. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't need to. The footage spoke for her. The logs did. The silence from the agents said the rest. Vote was quick. Unanimous. She was removed as president pending the outcome of the investigation. When I walked back into my house that afternoon, the place felt different. Not safer, not triumphant, just quieter. Like a storm had passed without tearing anything down, but had rearranged everything all the same. I sat at my desk, watched packets flow across my monitor, and wondered how something so small had grown so large, and whether it was really over yet. The thing about consequences is that they don't arrive all at once. They seep in. Quietly, they rearrange the air before anyone notices the furniture has moved. By the time evening rolled around, the street had settled into something that almost looked like normal. Kids were back on scooters. Chalk dust smeared across the sidewalk like nothing important had happened. Someone 2 houses down grilled burgers. A lawn sprinkler ticked rhythmically in the heat. If you hadn't been there that morning, you might have missed the significance entirely. But for the people who knew, everything felt slightly off, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. I sat in my garage office with the door open, listening to the low, steady hum of my equipment. That sound mattered to me more than I'd ever admitted. Not just because it meant I could work, but because it meant the world was behaving. The way it was supposed to, cause and effect. Input and output. Systems responding predictably. Around sunset, I noticed her across the street. Margaret stood at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, staring at nothing in particular. No clipboard, no papers. Just her, reduced to a silhouette against her own house. For the first time since I'd moved in, she looked unsure of where she belonged. I didn't plan to walk over. I really didn't. Every rational part of my brain told me to leave it alone. Let the process do what processes do. But there was something unfinished hanging between us. And I knew if I ignored it, it would follow me longer than I wanted. It's so I grabbed 2 coffees from my kitchen, crossed the street, and stopped a few feet away. I held one out. She looked at it like it might explode. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "That's fine," I said. "I just figured I'd offer." There was a long pause. It's a kind where you can hear your own breathing. Finally, she took it. "They're making me out to be some kind of criminal," she said, staring into the cup. I was just enforcing the rules. I leaned against the hood of my car. Rules don't include cutting. Someone's property, I said, and they definitely don't include triggering a federal investigation. Her jaw tightened. "You don't understand what it's like to keep order," she said. "If you let one thing slide, everything slides. People stop caring. They stop listening." I almost laughed, but there was too much sadness wrapped up in it. "You weren't keeping order," I said. "You were controlling people." There's a difference. She didn't argue. That was the most telling part. I thought about all the times she'd stood at the end of my driveway. All the warnings and violations that never quite stuck. It had never really been about cables or antennas. It was about power, about being the one who decided what was acceptable. And when she couldn't decide anymore, she cut the line instead. I left her there with the coffee and walked back to my house. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The investigation moved slowly after that. Quietly, no sirens. No dramatic arrests, just paperwork and interviews and follow-ups. I was asked to provide logs showing how the outage affected my work, although I sent them. I was told the case could end in fines, restitution, or charges if intent was formally established. Intent was the key word. It always is. Margaret stopped attending neighborhood events. Her house went dark earlier than usual. When people passed her on the street, they nodded. Politely, but didn't stop. The invisible authority she'd worn for years had evaporated, and without it, she didn't seem to know how to occupy space. The HOA elected an interim president, a soft-spoken woman named Barbara, who started meetings by asking how people were doing and actually waiting for the answer. Violations dropped. Conversations lengthened. The neighborhood exhaled. A week later, someone left a note in my mailbox. No name, just a single sentence. Some lines should never be crossed. I stood there for a while, holding it, wondering who had written it. Maybe Arthur. Maybe Barbara. Maybe someone who'd been afraid to speak up before. Or maybe it was just the neighborhood, collectively trying to make sense of what had happened. Because here's the thing no one really talks about. Margaret didn't wake up one day and decide to become the villain. She didn't see herself that way. In her mind, she was protecting something fragile. A sense of order. A version of community that made sense to her. But somewhere along the way, enforcement turned into entitlement. Authority turned into ownership. And when she felt that ownership threatened, she acted. That's how these things usually go. A month later, I saw her again at the grocery store. She avoided eye contact, looked smaller somehow. I thought about saying something about offering closure, but I realized closure isn't something you give. It's something people find on their own. My internet has been flawless ever since. Faster, if anything. The provider upgraded the line, added extra monitoring, flagged it as sensitive infrastructure. I check the log sometimes, watching the green indicators pulse steadily, and I can't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. A single cut cable. One bad decision. And suddenly, a quiet suburban street had brushed up against systems far larger than itself. People like to think justice is loud, that it arrives with flashing lights and dramatic speeches. But most of the time, it's quiet, procedural, unemotional. It shows up in timestamps and documentation, and conversations that happen behind closed doors. And it doesn't care who you are in your own story. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Margaret had just knocked on my door that night, if she'd said she was worried, if she'd asked instead of acted. Maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe we'd still be nodding politely across the driveway. But she didn't. She crossed a line that wasn't hers to cross, and the world responded in the only way it knows how. Calmly, thoroughly, permanently. So I'll leave you with this. If you were in her place, would you have done the same thing? Convinced you were right. If you were in mine, would you have pushed back or let it slide to keep the peace? And where do you draw the line between rules that protect a community and power that slowly poisons it? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read every one. Subscribe to HOA Conflicts for more.